All right, welcome to the Footy Museum and the Footy Museum podcast. I am Justin Whitty, and I am the co-director of this here Footy Museum, and I'm joined by fellow co-director Maria Van Dyken. Lee, Maria, how are you doing?
I'm steeped in the knowledge of the past, and I feel empowered.
Oh my gosh. And the reason Maria is feeling this way is because we have been doing some research on the history of football in Chicago. Because as you may or may not know, Maria and I and the Footy Museum is a project based on doing exhibitions around football culture, history, design. And when we did our redesign of our logo, we thought it'd be fun to kind of create a history around it. And to do that, we did some research of actual Chicago history, and it was fascinating, so much so that we decided to do a number of episodes based on that history.
Yeah, get a little deeper.
So that's where we're going to start today. So today is the first part of that series. It's exciting, but before we jump into the soccer, I just want to mention kind of some context about how I first started thinking about this subject, and also why I think this history is so fascinating. So as a child of the 90s, every time there was a biopic released at Studio 28, that is what we studied in school. And then we would go get our free tickets to the biopic. So Apollo 13, Schindler's List, and also Spike Lee's Malcolm X. Now, credit to my teachers, before the Malcolm X film, unlike the other ones, we actually did read the autobiography of Malcolm X written by Alex Haley. And it was a very fascinating, formative book for me, not only to see the arc of this very interesting figure, but also his early history. When he was young, he worked for the Pullman Palace Car Company as a car cleaner.
I didn't know that.
And he was one of many notable African-American historical figures that worked for this company. One of them being Thurgood Marshall, the former Supreme Court Justice, was a Pullman porter. Oh. And I learned through the book kind of this history. The Pullman porters were usually largely Black men who worked for the Pullman Palace Car Company as helping people, bring in their luggage, serve them, and really provide a very high level of service, because the Pullman Car Company was focused on creating luxury train cars for luxury travel. Now, the Pullman porters were very esteemed in their community because they were very well dressed. They got to travel the country in a time when not a lot of African Americans were allowed to travel.
Yeah.
And even though the Pullman Company paid them kind of atrocious wages, they did get tips, and they were able to save, and Pullman porters were really one of the first steps in establishing a Black middle class in this country. So it was this fascinating history. At the same time, as I mentioned, they weren't really necessarily well paid. So a number of them eventually joined the Brotherhood of Pullman Porters, which was the first Black labor union in the country, the foundation of which taught them principles and practices that really informed the civil rights movement. And the reason I'm all mentioning this now on the soccer podcast is because we had, this place, this company, and this time, and these events that kind of all intertwined, and they end up affecting the rest of the fabric of culture.
Yeah. And
it's fascinating because Pullman, which is a company based in Chicago, really largely was that. And that was no more the case than really at the end of the Gilded Age and the turn of the 19th century. So 1890s, Gilded Age, there's a lot of wealth in this country. Mm-hmm. And George Pullman was kind of aware that sleeping cars and train cars were not as nice as maybe they could be. So he started a company to create luxurious train cars. And he's founded that company in 1867. Here you see one of the Pullman cars. It's very decorative, beautiful. Here it's actually fresh off the factory. And the insides were, phenomenal. It's like chandeliers, plush seats. Now, Pullman would operate up until the middle of the 20th century, and the style would keep up. But this is really what we're talking about at that time.
The Gilded Age.
And I can't imagine going in a train with these with like chandeliers and like
I can't
It would
imagine.
just be so loud.
Yeah, you'd be going and it'd be like,
Yeah. And it's like, this is so nice. Like with your tea.
with your crystal cup, and you're like,
Because the railway still was from the 1800s. But you get a sense of kind of the glamour or the prestige and level of quality they were trying to produce.
This is the kind of thing you only see now from like behind a stanchion.
Yeah, you go to like a railroad museum, it's like, that dusty old chair was one of the most.
You're like,
But Pullman found a lot of success with this business. You know, there was a lot of need for it. This was the primary way to travel around the country. And his company, like a lot of companies at that time, just exploded. So much so that when he was already operating in the Chicago area, he bought 4,000 acres just south of what was the boundaries of the city that time, along Lake Calumet. And he built his own town, Pullman. And the idea is the Pullman Palace Car Company was one of these paternalistic industries. The idea is that if we give our workers a place to stay, if we keep them engaged, they will less likely to, be intoxicated.
They will be sober and happy.
Focused. And if we keep them healthy, they will be good workers.
Yes.
And it's like, it's kind of a the idea is like, it's nice to give the workers, but at the same time, it's treating them like cogs in a machine.
Yeah. And
just like that early story, as I started, there's the complexity to that history. Here you have a rendering of Pullman. And he didn't just build it, he brought in top architects, landscape designers of the time. And he built what was a fairly charming community. The row homes he built for workers were very light filled. They all had green space. There were parks.
It seems like if he was going to do it, he's going to do it right.
Yeah, that's right. He was going all the way. He made luxury train cars. He wasn't going to make,
Yeah, he can make row homes.
Yeah, he's going to make some nice row homes. And even the factory itself was gorgeous, the main factory. There's a famous hotel in Pullman. In fact, Pullman today is a National Historic Site. It is now, and it has been, even while it was most of the time of the company, was annexed by the city of Chicago. But here you see the main hotel down there. And as you can see on the right, it's still there. And you see some example of some of those row homes that he built. And if you ever have a chance, I'd recommend checking out the main building is a national park. They have phenomenal exhibits and history about that area. But another thing with that encouragement, they also formed a lot of teams for their workers. And Pullman even formed a lot of football teams, soccer teams for both men and women. Here we're looking at a picture of a 1920s women's team from Pullman. I can't imagine wearing skirts and sweaters and...
Well, it looks like they're wearing like pantaloons.
Oh, excuse me.
But they are wearing like tights.
Now, pantaloons, I can imagine. I take it back.
That
was actually
have a pair, right?
Earlier this week when EA Sports accidentally leaked the MLS Cup, the biggest thing was everyone's going to wear pantaloons this year. I mean, that was...
Bring it back.
Yeah, and belts, because they also wore belts at the time.
Because they didn't have elastic.
Yes. But they also fielded a men's team. Pullman A.F.C. I could not find an image from that time of Pullman A.F.C. So I used our AI overlords to draw from existing images to imagine. So this is an imagined view. It looks like a team of 4 players and a bunch of administrators, but just to give the idea. And this Pullman team, Pullman A.F.C., was the main team of the club. Now there was also another team in Pullman called the Thistles, and it was kind of interchangeable with the Pullman team. And the Thistles, if you know Chicago history, and I know you're going to talk about them as well, were kind of the dominant team. But the players kind of changed. They played different places. So Pullman and Thistles were kind of the same team, although the Thistles were not the official team of the club.
Yeah, there was like a lot of back and forth between these teams. The Pullman team was the official one of the company. The Thistles had a little bit more flexibility. These were more wealthy members of the company who had the resources and time to be able to take time off to travel if they were traveling under the Thistles. And they also had more flexibility when it came to playing in the Chicago League, which had
Okay.
distance limits for how far you could be away from actually City Hall.
Okay.
So it was kind of their workaround for getting into these different spaces. But there was basically, like, if you were Pullman, you were Thistles. If you were Thistles, you were Pullman.
Right.
But they would play each other occasionally, and those drew like huge crowds from the community.
Because then it would almost be like the worker class versus the little more.
Potentially. I didn't find
yeah.
anything specific about that, but it was like the big scrimmage of the whole community of
Yeah.
the town. And it would draw like over 1,000 people to this
It's
event.
like Cubs White Sox.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's almost exactly like that.
It is 1,000% like that.
Yeah. So for some friendlies out of town, like in St. Louis or in Massachusetts or in Milwaukee, Pullman would sponsor the trip, and then they would play as Pullman and not as the Thistles.
Okay.
So there was that as well.
Even though the players would be all the Thistle players.
It was just like totally intertwined.
And in this time, the late 1800s, 1890s, a lot of the teams forming, not only in Chicago, but in the nation kind of followed that structure, right? You had corporate teams from these paternalistic companies, I think Marshall Fields even fielded a team sometimes in Chicago. And then you had kind of these gentlemen clubs.
Yeah, it was 3 versions. There's a athletic club, like a gentlemanly leisure class level sponsoring a team, or then it was a paternalistic corporation sponsoring a team meant to like keep its workers happy and healthy. And then
sober and fit.
And then there were neighborhood teams as well.
What's distinctive from Pullman from the Thistles is that they took part in one of the seminal moments of Chicago footballing history. And that was in 1883, they played the first ever official game under association rules of football. And they played one of these gentlemen type clubs.
Yeah.
It was the Chicago Wanderers and Cricket Club. And the first game ever played was at Pullman, at their athletic complex called The Playground, which sadly, after Pullman died, was raised and incorporated into the manufacturing side of the building. But here we see the Wanderers. Like to be fair, this photo is from 1904, but they're still rocking the pantaloons and the boot and the belts, pantaloons and the belts.
Time traveler Dr. Strange Benedict Cumberbatch is number 6 in the back row.
I've noticed Benedict Cumberbatch in a lot of these teams. I think he has some answering to do.
But there was a lot of player attrition throughout all the teams, so they would join different groups. So I have a newspaper quote about this game.
Yes.
This is from the British American. And quote, a match will be played at Pullman Thanksgiving Day at 11:30 in the morning between Pullman Club and the Wanderers Football Club of Chicago. This match will be played under the new rules, parentheses, association, end parentheses, and as many of the players have quite a record at the game, the public will no doubt enjoy seeing the sport. The team of the Wanderers will be as follows. And then it goes on to list all the players.
Oh, huzzah, huzzah.
I know. It's like, it's in the paper.
I think
extra. Read all about it.
I think it's so fascinating. And as a sport that's often talked about with so little history and tradition in this country, to think back, this is the same time the biggest clubs in the world were forming. This is all the same time. And it was really taking root here the same way.
Simultaneous.
Yeah. There were belts and pantaloons across the planet. Now, you have some more information about this period and immediately right after.
Yeah.
So what happened after this game, after this first official game?
Yeah.
I got to grow a mustache.
So after this speaking of newspapers, I have a couple slides that are just newspaper clippings, but look at these spreads.
Always exciting.
Sorry.
Always exciting. It's like early 90s web design. Lots of text. Lots of text.
Don't worry, I will explain. So after this game, there were, like we mentioned, the gentlemen's like athletic clubs were kind of taking the lead role in forming what would become the basically organized Chicago soccer scene. And these clubs were like leisure class, upper middle class, upper class, white collar workers who had a lot of time, affluence, and money. And these athletic clubs they were a part of were interested in preserving their like ethnic heritage because they're basically all immigrants.
And at this time, it was a lot of the big clubs, if I'm not incorrect, were English,
Scottish specifically.
Yeah.
Chicago was really influenced by Scottish playing style too.
Which was quick passing, kind of like build up play versus like the long bombing English style.
Yeah, versus long ball, which was more popular in St. Louis, or
losers.
I know, right? Or like a dribbling style. And,
kick it hard, St. Louis.
like imagine 7 players all in one row. People are just dribbling it up. It's like insane. So they're really interested in preserving ethnic heritage and creating places for people to connect.
Yeah.
And that way they're also exclusive, right? Which is,
But why am I looking at a newspaper?
Oh, so we're looking at a newspaper because 3 of these athletic associations formed the first league. Yes, they formed the first football association, the Chicago Football Association.
CFA,
in
yes.
1886, yes, which we will now refer to as CFA. And this newspaper clipping is not from that year, but it is reporting on the new formation again of another season, another election of boards. So like this is the kind of thing that's being reported on in the paper.
Yeah, they're like this new. Well, it's the same way other new sports are taking hold. We've had this game; it's forming, and
not only that, like these guys have community clout. They're essentially socialites, right? Like they're constantly being
like the Wanderers and people on those teams. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So like they're writing about individuals in the paper.
Mm-hmm.
The first 3 clubs that formed the association were the Northwestern Football Association, the Chicago Football Association Club, and the Wanderers of the Cricket Club.
The Wanderers of the Cricket, which has its own fascinating history.
It does.
So, yeah.
Yeah. So and then from 86 to 99, like we said, the membership was fluctuating from 6 to 8 like full-time soccer teams with like more coming in. They had a couple divisions. They organized the rules, they organized friendlies, they organized tournaments, they had the Jackson Cup and everything. So the
Jackson Cup was the championship, the first cup awarded in league play in Chicago, and it was in this league.
Yeah.
And Pullman wasn't initially part of the league, right?
No, but the Thistles were able to be a part
because so they were kind of part of it, yeah.
But and the Thistles were the dominant force. They had 7 championships in that period of time. So, the Wanderers also pretty big.
Well, the name the Wanderers, you see that a lot.
And Thistles.
You see Thistles and Wanderers a lot.
And it's connected with the Scottish heritage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you still see, are there still, I know there's still like Wolverhampton Wanderers, there's like original Wanderers. And that term makes sense with kind of the leisurely upper class gentleman style, like wandering, looking for leisure and adventure.
And it's very like
carefree sportsmen.
Sports for sports sake. Like they valued
like
the
pure
amateur. Like these guys were like people would come in from out of town, other teams that they would play, and they would wine and dine them the night before. The next day they'd go play the game, and then the next day they wined and dined them again before putting them on the train back to St. Louis.
And then they would buy their homes and burn them to the ground.
It was all about like cigar rooms and stuff. So
it was the birth of the old boys club.
Yeah, it was definitely, and that's probably why you see some of that to this day, because it's like.
Well, for years the center of U.S. soccer, when it was in Chicago up until a month ago, up yours, U.S. soccer. was actually in an old mansion with like woodline walls, very much had that history. So anyway, continue.
Yeah. But yeah, so that's like totally the vibe. And not only were they organizing in Chicago, like there were other hotbeds around the area. This is a clipping from 91 about the match that they held between the champions of St. Louis and the champions of Chicago every year. And that was the championship of the West. The first one, which was held in 86. This is from 91, but the first one was in 86, and that was between the Chicago Football Association, or the Chicagos, versus the St. Louis Thistles. And there were 1,000 fans in attendance. Chicago won 5-1, and organizers were like, "Hey, this thing's has legs. Like we can do this.
Yeah,
like people are loving this."
Well, to think that Chicago and St. Louis played in a soccer championship 140 years ago. And MLS has decided to put them in different conferences. Right? Like
how can you have the championship of the West?
Like, what other teams are you telling me that like the Dallas Burn were playing the LA Galaxy in 1886? No, come on, MLS, get with it.
Know.
Pick up a book. All right.
Yes, pick up a very big book. Oh, so here's a couple photos of the Wanderers. We've seen this one on the right before with Benedict Cumberbatch. I'm not sure what year this one on the left was taken in.
I love how I don't think you could get your haircut as much back then. So there's like so many unintentionally hipster haircuts from this period.
I feel like one of those guys today.
Oh, I'm pretty sure the gentleman in the middle also inherited a Chicago beef restaurant from his brother who died and then turned it into a high-end dining. I'm pretty sure he's kind of an intense figure. Also,
and was an underwear model on the side.
I'm pretty sure. That's a different history. Carry on.
Oh, yeah. So one of my favorite stories from the Wanderers is, and this has to do with Chicago landscape as well, and the pitch conditions being a little tricky. And winter being tough. And like,
because they played they played the traditional cycle. They played through the winter, right?
Yeah, they played 2 seasons a year, playing through the winter and in prairie. And if you've ever tried to dig into raw prairie, like good luck.
Those of you who dig into raw prairie know what we're talking about. You city slickers out there, you may not know the challenge of such rugged and rough earth.
Yeah, people just sod busting over here.
Yep.
Anyways,
it is bumpy.
It is bumpy. It's hard.
Sandy,
it's hard
stuff.
Clay, sand, roots. Anyways, it's tough. It's tough dirt, and it's what is made of Chicago's swamp and prairie, and that's where these guys are playing. And
so you're not saying it wasn't always the most elegant game.
These are uppity guys, man. They're like, they're the ones using those train cars. And there's this one story where a Wanderers player got really frustrated and then kicked a ball into Lake Michigan, and it delayed the game. Like, you only have one ball.
They had to go out and kill a pig and blow up its stomach to play the rest of the game. Luckily, Chicago also home to many slaughterhouses. There are plenty of pigs to kill, so it worked out.
Oh man.
Speaking of the Wanderers Cricket Club, because they were kind of a big player in athletics in the city, not just with their football team. Where were they headquartered?
Oh, where were they headquartered? A little intersection at 39th and Wentworth.
39th and Wentworth?
39th and Wentworth?
Yeah, you said 3rd and 9th and Wentworth.
No, I said 39th and Wentworth.
That's a familiar location. Isn't that right by what was Comiskey, the White Sox Park?
Come to think of it, they might have sold it to a man named Comiskey.
Oh my God.
In the year of our Lord 1900 for his White Stockings baseball club.
So the White Sox play essentially on the ground of the Wanderers Cricket Club.
Yeah. Correct.
Nothing changes.
And they were playing soccer on the cricket grounds before the turn of the century. Wasn't until a little while later that they had dedicated grounds. So that's where the Wanderers play, is where the White Sox play.
Crazy add to that is that the White Sox, there's rumor they're considering building a downtown stadium in the Loop. And there was, I don't know if this is true or not, the suggestion maybe the Fire would go to the White Sox location. Like, what a weird, everyone's just trading the same things over and over again.
It's wild. I mean, that'd be kind of cool in some ways.
So is this that location at the time?
Yeah, this is from the paper.
It looks different than the last time I was there.
Me too.
Where's the red line stop?
They also the Wanderers were known as the Wentworths after they moved from that specific location. So they went by both names, somewhat interchangeably. I
would say just like Madrid and Chicago Fire, a lot of people don't know that they're the same team.
Moving on. Okay, this is just
more newspapers.
This is one little tidbit. We can.
No, I love it.
Cut this if we have to.
No, not at all.
This is a little write-up in a paper that I was like, why is this being published? And it just goes to show like how much these guys were just socialites, because it's talking about these 2 players, one of them from the Wanderers, Joseph Fletcher, captain of the Chicago Wanderers Cricket and Athletic Club, and N.E. Rooker, captain of the Chicago Football Club, arrived yesterday by the steamer Britannic after a tour of pleasure through Europe. And it's like, why are you writing about it? It's like, this guy's going to get married. This guy is going to be playing cricket until the football season starts. I'm like, so that's what this is. These guys are Like when I think
What a
immigrants,
life.
when I think of immigrants, this isn't what I think of, honestly, because this isn't my family's experience, right? So yeah.
Why? What luxury steamer did your family come over on? Yeah. So
My great grandparents traded
not...
a sack of potatoes for a winter coat.
My grandfather dressed up like a barrel and snuck up on a ship. These guys. So that what really was, there was very much a gentleman class at play.
This was the gentleman
What
class.
a life though, to be like, I'm going to go cruise, and when I get off the boat, I'm going to play a game of association football.
Yes.
And then,
The new rules.
with the new rules, and have some cigars at the Chicago Athletic Club afterwards. Huzzah.
But that's not the full story, though.
Oh, it's not.
It's not. There's, like we said earlier, there's a different class of people playing. But
a suited class.
well, these guys,
A roughly suited
a
class.
roughly suited class.
Look at the lapels.
Yeah, this group right here is the Braidwood Miners, and they work for the Braidwood Mining Company. And this is the other type, like we mentioned, the corporate sponsored. But this is unskilled labor. And that's the difference. So a lot of the guys playing at Pullman were skilled craftsmen.
Right.
Even if they weren't
These were miners.
the uppity, like upper class guys. These guys are miners. They're in the mines. They're digging all day.
Right.
Coal miners. So
I've heard coal dust is good for aerobic activity.
I've heard that as well too. It's all the rage. They're selling it at Sephora. Anyways,
And they were involved in league play as
they
well.
were
Yeah.
not
Or playing with teams from Chicago.
because they were outside Chicago. So once again, they couldn't be fully a part of the CFA.
Right.
But they were involved with league play. That's what a lot of these groups were. The Braidwood Miners and the Illinois Steel Company. Those were the two kind of main successful teams that did a lot of friendlies or like did incorporate into the league play sometimes with the other Chicago teams like the Wanderers and the Thistles. And then otherwise there was like Marshall Fields, the Aurora Hercules, the Coal Hours, it was under that like capitalist ideology, the control of the worker, the like make them happy, keep them happy, make them happy workers thing.
Fit. Yeah.
But on the other hand, these guys were really good.
Yeah.
The Braidwood Miners were really good. They formed as early as 1888. Like I said, it was the first team created by unskilled laborers. There was one instance where in '93, a Canadian All-Star team had come to Chicago to play like the richer teams. And they were doing a 2-game series, and on their day off between games, they were like encouraged to go play these guys. Yeah. So these guys worked all day in the mines, came out and played the Canadian All-Stars and beat them 5-1.
That's right. That's right. They did. You know it. But also, when you think about it, so often when we talk about games, so much commentary just drops to like a basic, like, well, they really have a desire. They really have a drive. They have a passion for this game. And I think there's a different mentality versus I just got off my steamliner from Europe. I'm going to play an association football game I've been in the mines all week. I get to go play this game. And guess what? I'm going to play some of those hoity assholes that look down on me the rest of the week. And so I imagine the intensity level was very different. And I imagine the physicality was very different, especially because they're playing on that rough prairie side.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or like sometimes they'd play in like shipyards, Anyway, okay.
Oh, who's this strapping young man?
This strapping young man. I have a couple here just shout outs to like a couple player highlights. Yeah. This is a portrait of soccer player Ben Govier. Govier. This is actually from 1905, but he played for Pullman and the Thistles throughout the decade we were talking about.
Oh, wow.
And then he went to play in St. Louis for a little while and then came back and played in the Chicago scene for like 20 years.
Oh my gosh.
For the rest of his playing career. And he was known as the greatest player in America. Wow. By people who said that he was the greatest player in America. I think locally.
Amongst those who classified him as greatest player in America, he was the greatest player in America.
But look at him kicking that ball.
What is the P in this?
I assume it's Pullman.
Yeah. Very different from the AI generated imaginings. He looks like a proper footballer.
And look at that like proper pitch too.
And an action shot from 1904.
I know that ball is rare. Still like nearly in focus.
I do wish more fields had slat wooden fences along the outfield, though. That would be a nice touch.
Mm-hmm. Maybe when they redo the Sox field.
Maybe when the Fire finally build the stadium. Who else do we have? Is there other players of interest from the time?
Yes. So
Ooh.
this is an interesting case because he didn't
Look at
play.
those calves. Is that allowed back then to show that much calf? Was this like kind of an X-rated card?
He was kind of a character from what I understand. But this is Tower of Strength, Harry Boyd.
Oh, Harry Boyd. I've heard of the Tower of Strength.
Yeah, and he played in Europe for Sunderland Albion.
That's right.
Before moving,
Albion, which we know is just another word for Great Britain.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Before coming to the U.S., I think he was only here for like a little over a year, but he played with the Thistles / Pullman and traveled to Fall River, Massachusetts for their traveling team and played against Fall River and then like just jumped ship and played for Fall River. And then eventually made his way back to England and played for Burnley and then what is now Arsenal.
Oh my gosh.
And so like this is a legitimate player with an international playing career and he played in the U.S.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
100 years ago.
And in Chicago.
Yeah, and in Chicago.
And he was an illicit calf exposer.
And he potentially died of an STD.
Well, you know, when you're showing that much calf traveling around.
It's also reported that he was kind of a violent man on and off the field. So that's why he was the Tower of Strength. However,
he just sounds like your modern day footballer, top to bottom.
So he
also had a very contentious deal with Adidas.
So yeah, that's just to illustrate that there was an exchange. There were communities, and there wasn't like an international playing market to some degree.
Well, yeah, and there was, with that in mind, there were, like you mentioned, there were already these organized games between cities and also between like Canadian and U.S. teams. But there would also be teams that would travel through the U.S., like the Pilgrims. But that kind of led up to the World Columbian Exposition in 1893. So this is the same, like 10 years after the first association football game, the world's kind of turning its eyes on Chicago for this anniversary of Columbus's discovery of America. And if you live in Chicago, this is an event that still has a shadow over the city today. You can still find elements of it. If you go to the Museum of Science and Industry, Museum of Science and Industry, the only building left because the rest, or actually I think it was recreated because they were all made out of basically straw and
it was just like
spit.
wheat paste, right?
It was just stucco basically, and the whole thing burned down and was destroyed at the end. But like so many other things, this also was a host of what was potentially going to be the first international football competition.
AKA World Cup.
The World Cup.
Chicago, the home of the World Cup.
So the way this happened is that in an attempt to kind of lure the Corinthians football club, which was a very famous British football club at the time that traveled the world and is kind of credited with popularizing the sport throughout the world.
I like their little caps.
Yeah. That is an organized team photo. And look at that crest. That is a lot of overlapping. So in an attempt to lure them to play in Chicago and also to attract teams from Canada and South America, there was an attempt to create this tournament. So basically it would be the Chicago Columbian Exposition World Football Tournament. And the way it built is first, there was already planned to be a showcase with the conjunction of the Amateur Athletic Union Sport Fest in a period in September towards the end. But there was also a period in July, like late July, beginning August, that was set aside for a tournament. And then that aligned with the Caledonian and Scottish Assembly Sport Festival. So if you're thinking of the Scottish importance, the Thistles, it kind of made sense that they would have a lot of focus on the game at that time. And then finally, it was listed early that the final day of the fair, which was Canadian Day, they're always last, was to feature football. So William Baird, who was a Toronto resident and an enthusiast of Chicago soccer, saw these fixtures and used them to make an announcement that the Corinthians would be coming to Chicago to participate. So it sounds like maybe it was like kind of like hopefully pushing it, bringing together already planned events and trying to build that into an actual tournament and to bring in this team to draw attention to it. The Tribune added a lot. The Chicago Tribune added a lot to that excitement by hearing that news and then doing a full page feature on the Corinthians, the players, their kind of history, their record. And then
I sure would like to see that full page.
Oh, I would love to see. I bet there's a lot. But it's not just words. I bet there's like designs and things. After that, that lured kind of Ontario and Philadelphia. Philadelphia was also a major center of the sport at the time to sign on to participate in the tournament. And then 2 months later, the World's Fair Athletic Committee extended invitations to other teams in Europe and South America. So you had the potential for this, if not World Cup, Club World Cup. This is before FIFA, before soccer was in the Olympics. It's before all the like Noche de Ors. This was potentially out of Chicago just within 10 years of that first game, the first international competition on par with Champions League, anything like that, which is really phenomenal.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it didn't work out so well.
I think especially too, because what I kept just thinking about with all these, even just like getting across town games, I'm thinking, it would take so long to get from this suburb to this, from Braidwood to Pullman, all these things. I'm like, I don't want to go to Pullman on just a weekday. It'd take too long.
It's a 40-minute drive now.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Although the train, there's probably a lot more trains back then.
More
Pullman trains.
Yeah, Pullman trains that you can look at from behind a stanchion.
What if you could not take the train from Pullman? That would have been bad.
You get here and you never.
So traveling was difficult, and that's ultimately the problem. So in early July, so this is just before that longer part of the tournament, the late July to August, when it was actually going to take place, Corinthians pulled out because of high travel fares and rates. They were the main draw and kind of the reason a lot of these other teams had agreed. So a lot of other teams also withdrew. And then, so they settled for a 2-game visit from a Canadian soccer team, which I think was this game.
Oh yeah, that's what I was
when
talking
they went against Braidwood. So they played their 2-game tournament. That's also the period in which they went and played Braidwood. And then that was followed by a 6-team tournament that was hosted by the Scottish Athletic Club, because remember, it was during that period honoring the Scottish Assembly Sport Festival. They had this tournament, so that would have probably really focused on the Thistles. And although that tournament did have some outside Chicago players, it was not what they imagined, and they were playing for the Bain Cup. Bain! So although it didn't like really come together, it was so close, and I also it shows how pivotal Chicago was in this early period and how fascinating. And I'll go back to the point of that it was not behind the rest of the world. It was in line with the rest of the world, the development of the sport.
Yeah. The development of soccer in Great Britain with the 2 classes playing in different ways is very much also in line with the way it was here. After
the fair, because this was a time when things were put up and then destroyed, and just like, which was really the ethos from the beginning in America, which is part of the reason we have to share this history now, is because it gets lost. Much of the World's Fair grounds was destroyed by fire or purposely destroyed after the World's Fair, and that oddly kind of foretold the coming years for the CFA. So as you mentioned, between 1896 and 1899, the membership fluctuated between 6 and 8 teams in the CFA. In 1899, the league dropped to its lowest ever of 5 teams and only competed one of their 2 seasons in the spring season. And it's unclear why there was such a steep kind of drop off and it lost its popularity. There's one theory that it was the Spanish-American War because of people being called, I imagine, to go fight. And also maybe some of the politics surrounding that war. There was also labor unrest in different parts of the country that affected some of these players and teams and industries. But a big part of it was in Chicago is, again, back to The Thistles decided to leave the league because they were not equipped to compete properly, and rather than not compete at the top level, they just decided to pull out of the league. 99, the Tribune did post a schedule for a season of 5 teams, but it's not clear that any of those games were ever played. So that kind of destruction of the World's Fair, it showed kind of the peak of that period, but also the end that was very much mirrored by this first chapter in Chicago soccer history. But it was only the first chapter.
Yeah.
And the next chapter, as Maria promises, has more pictures. So we're going to pick up from that point, from basically the turn of the century going forward, and see how it continued to grow and flourish both in Chicago and in the U.S. And I'm looking forward to that. Any other thoughts before we end this? I love it. I'm just so into it.
It's great. I'm often envious of architecture in Europe.
Yeah.
But like you were saying, I mean, like architecture is how we see history around us.
Yeah.
And thinking specifically about like the White Sox Stadium, that was the Wanderers go on to, like in a different iteration, still be a club and a powerhouse for like the next however many years. And there's no, like where their home was, there is nothing to do with soccer.
Yeah.
It is still a huge architectural thing, a huge monument to the city, but for baseball. Yeah. Right?
It's a replacement.
Yeah.
I think that's a really strong point. And I think that having a physical space that retains history makes your awareness of it, but also highlights your involvement in it. Mm-hmm. And when you feel connected to a place as part of its history, you have a more of a passion and a commitment to that place and a stewardship of that place. Yeah. And I think not just in Chicago, where you definitely see that, but nationally in this country. And I think what we're finding out is part of the story of why football, soccer kind of faded, is because so much of it is tied into history, identity, and tradition. And so much of the story of the United States is starting fresh, tearing down, and ignoring the past. Yeah. But the amazing thing about history is that it's easily resurrected. Not easily, it can be resurrected. The stories don't go away. And when we do find them and you do share them, it starts to make people realize the connections to their surroundings and rebuild that connection. And I think that's what's behind a lot of what we do with this project. We want to make those connections and again, use this sport as a lens to just talk about living and existing and what does that mean. And that's why you're wearing your striped football jersey today. Because you just want to bring back the style of the
I was like, what should I wear? I'm going to go back in time. I'm going to wear like a jersey sweater. I know it's not the 2-inch stripe as they require, but it does have stripes.
At the same time, knowing now where these places are, I think we should start to try to find them and mark them so other people can have that connection as well. So that's it. I think that's it for this week. It was a lot.
It was a lot, but it was very fun.
It was fun.
Should we give a shout out to like some of the source material?
Well, we should. Absolutely.
Yeah.
We relied heavily on one book for this research.
One particular book by Gabe Logan, who did a full history of the early years of Chicago soccer. What's it called? Chicago Soccer History, 1877 to 19 something something. It is a treasure trove. It is a treasure trove. It is a academic like textbook that focuses on the economics and sociology of the sport in the city. There's also the U.S. Society for Soccer History.
U.S. Society for Soccer History, U.S. Soccer, and specifically the history of the U.S. Open Cup, the Illinois Soccer Association, I believe it's called, their website as well.
Chicago House publishes a lot of things online.
Chicago House has a lot of history as well. So there are some good online resources. But what's interesting in that is in the research, we found most commonly, there were some things that contradict each other. Like what's the Wanderers' actual team name?
Mm-hmm. What year did
were
this
the
happen?
dates? There was a common misconception on a lot of sites that cited that first game in 1893.
Which is not true.
Which when we looked at kind of the timeline, it was impossible. And I think that just goes back to there's just not a lot of documented history out there. The fact that it's so hard to find any images related to the early Pullman or Thistle teams that were so dominant just shows how much of it has been lost. So if you do happen to listen and because I know there's people out there who know about this and have resources and say, hey, you're not thinking of this resource, please let us know. And that truly is the story of football. That actually was the story of football.
Yeah.
All right. We'll see you next week.